Hi everyone, it's me, Suhrab Sitanov again. So I'm a teacher at Urgen State University. I teach translation theory to university students. So in the previous video, I talked about how to develop your writing skills from paragraph to essay. Today, I'm going to give a lesson about my field at university. It's about translation. So today we will talk about types of translation and particularly spoken translation. Okay, so there are two types of translation. Well, lots of people know about it. This is spoken translation and written translation. Spoken translation when an interpreter or translator translates so what the speaker says in spoken form. So they speak. And in written translation, so this is when a person writes the text or anything which is given as information. Okay, so we can see lots of written translation in the form of books. Okay, lots of world literature in English, in Russian, when translated into Uzbek language, this is the form of written translation. So today we are not going to focus on written translation, it's a totally different topic, but today we are going to talk about spoken translation. Okay, spoken translation is divided into two, consecutive translation and simultaneous translation. So consecutive when a speaker and translator take turns to speak, all right? So if there are two speakers, so they speak to the translator and then the translator translates while the first speaker waits for his or her turn. So you can see this here. Consecutive translation or interpretation when an interpreter waits for their turn to translate. Okay, we call this, well, interpretation more than translation, because interpret or interpretation means understanding. So when the translator listens to the speech and understands and then, well, transforms this into another language, this is called interpretation, because the translator tries to speak what he or she understood in the source language. So we use these two terms in translation, source language and target language. Source language is the language of the speech. Okay, for example, if somebody speaks in English language, this is source language, and then we translate it into Uzbek language. So Uzbek language is target language because it's our aim to translate to this language. So we have these two languages, source language and target language. So interpretation when the translator or interpreter understands this source language and then translates it into target language. So, and in this situation, the speakers and the translator waits for their turn. Okay, first speaker speaks and then the second person is the translator. So translator listens and then translates it into the for the third person, the second speaker. So everything is in turn. So that's why it is called consecutive, because they wait for their turn. This is sequence. Okay, because of this we call this consecutive translation. Okay, you can see a really simple example of a consecutive translation here. So here, as you see, we have the customer. Okay, we have this customer. Okay. We have this customer, all right. And then we have this interpreter. Okay. This customer talks to the interpreter, and then interpreter understands what's going on and then tries to translate it into this people, all right, for these people, a person or group of people. So they try to translate it, okay, to different people. So they wait for their turns. Okay, when this customer, okay, talks to interpreter, interpreter waits and tries to understand what the customer is saying. And then this interpreter translates it to other people or person. And then they wait for their turns. And then when they have the chance to speak, they speak again while interpreter again waiting for her turn or his turn. And then they translate it into customer again. So as you see, okay, here we have this, all right, diagram. So from this to this, and then this goes back, okay, from this to interpreter and again to the customer. So this is how consecutive translation, well, is done. Okay, now you can see one good example of this consecutive translation when the translators wait for their turn in bilateral meetings between countries. As you can see in this picture, Donald Trump and Putin, all right, president of Russia, so had this meeting. So they had two translators. So you can see this translator, all right, from American side, and this translator is from the Russian side. So we have these two translators. So they wait for their turns to translate to presidents, and then they try to translate what each president said. Okay, so because of this, these two people had two translators. Well, two translators are needed when there is really serious issues are being discussed and two sides bring their own translators because of trust issues. But when there is, well, not so important topic, or when, all right, two sides can rely on one translator, there is no need for two translators. All right, so this kind of meetings among presidents or some kind of politics, so they require translators from both sides, no, from all sides. Okay. So this is a bilateral consecutive translation. And the next thing that we have to discuss is simultaneous translation. Simultaneous translation is really interesting and totally different from consecutive translation. Let's try to understand what is simultaneous translation. So for this, we should understand what does simultaneous mean. Simultaneous means at the same time. So in consecutive translation, translator waits and listens and tries to understand what's going on, and then they translate. In simultaneous translation, everything happens in a short period of time, so they have to translate at the same time while they listen. So they listen, they will understand, and they translate at the same time. So because of this, the name of this type of translation is called simultaneous. So they have to do it simultaneously at the same time. Okay, simultaneous translation has two types, okay, again. First one is translation with spatial equipment, and the second one is called chuchotage. It's in French, and it means in English whispering, because there is no spatial equipment, and the translator whispers to the ears of the speaker. Okay, so we will talk about each of them one by one. First one, translation with spatial equipment. As you can see in this picture, all right, there is an interpreter or translator sits in a soundproof booth. All right, so inside this booth, so there is no noise. Okay, so the interruptions, the noise, the sound outside the booth cannot be heard inside the booth because it is soundproof. All right, the translator or interpreter inside the booth wears headphones, and okay, this person listens to the speaker and then translates it directly to the microphone in front of them, all right, at the same time. And that's why it's called simultaneous translation. This spatial equipment, all right, allows the translator to listen with headphones and translate to the microphone. And through this microphone, the people who can listen to the speech also hear this through headphones. So each person in the conference or in the audience will have spatial headphones to listen to the, translation. But this simultaneous translation is really difficult and, takes lots of energy. So it is recommended to do this, simultaneous translation, no more than 30 minutes, between 15 minutes and 30 minutes. Because, all right, if a person does more than that, so they may have really big issues, all right, because it's really hard. And there were lots of cases when simultaneous translators translated more than enough and they had collapsed even. Okay, it happened in the UN Assembly. You can Google this and find out about it. So when the interpreter of Muammar Gaddafi, all right, collapsed after really serious translation. Okay, it's really interesting story. So I recommend watching it on Google. You can search for that. So this translation with spatial equipment, all right, should be done with a partner, all right? So two translators work at the same time. When the first person is working, the second one can relax. And when the first translator, feels tired, the second one can continue the translation. So that's why it's always recommended to work with a partner, because you cannot translate more than 30 minutes. It's really difficult. Okay, now let's talk about chuchotage. It's taken from French. All right, it's a French word. It means whispering. whispering translation. So it is when an interpreter translates to the listener's ears. So there is a reason for that. What is the reason? When there is lack of spatial equipment like headphones and microphones, whispering translation can be used. And this whispering translation was really common in the past when the technology wasn't so developed, when the spatial equipment wasn't available. People used this chuchotage translation. You can see a great example here when Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, the president of the US, met, and they had these two translators who used this chuchotage method. You can see these two, translators, this one and this one. So they translated what is going on to the ears of these presidents. So this is a simple example of chuchotage. So in the past, when the technology wasn't available, this chuchotage translation was really common. And even today, chuchotage is used when there is problem with the equipment. This kind of translation can be useful for people because they will have their individual translators, and instead of listening to the headphone, listening through the headphone, this kind of translation can be useful. But it is hard for the translators because they have to speak with low tone all the time, and then this can have some serious impact on their voice. So, well, no matter what type, translation is really difficult, and but it's an interesting job. So at university, we teach students all types of this spoken translation. We work with consecutive translation, we work with simultaneous translation, we work with bilateral translations, we work with whispering translations. And the students are doing really well. And hopefully we will be able to develop this translation in our university or even in the whole country. So we are working with this each type of translation to improve the skills of the future translators, future interpreters. And it is an interesting job which has a bright future, especially in our country, because in the past this field wasn't so developed, but now there is strong demand for translators as globalization is taking place all over the world, and lots of people, lots of investors, lots of business people will start coming to our country to do their businesses. So there is a strong demand for translators. And well, if you are watching this video, all right, please, if you are interested in translation, do your research, try to learn, try to practice a lot, and try to improve the translation sphere in your university, in your country, and never stop learning. Thank you so much.